Welcome to the Relationship Recovery Podcast, hosted by Jessica Knight, a certified life coach who specializes in narcissistic and emotional abuse. This podcast is intended to help you identify manipulative and abusive behavior, set boundaries with yourself and others, and heal the relationship with yourself so you can learn to love in a healthy way.
Hello, and thank you so much for being here. Before we dive into today's episode, I'm going to go over a few ways that you can get in contact with me and a few things that I would really appreciate, which I don't usually ask for, but if you like this podcast, if you could rate and review on whatever platform you're listening, that would help a ton. If you want to get more out of this podcast, you could subscribe. It's called Support the Show. It's in the show notes. For only $5, you can support this podcast, which pretty much enables me to have more time, space, and any extra money left over is used for donation coaching. So if somebody reaches out to me and they need extra support, I usually cut the fee in half, and that money allows that to happen. You could join me on Patreon, which is still a work in progress right now. I am in the process of uploading the videos, but that will be a place where we will have a monthly theme. And this month's theme is going to be the cycle of abuse and the nuances of the cycle of abuse. As far as programs, self-study, you can find me at emotionalabusecoach.com. There is an emotional abuse breakthrough course and 2 mini courses, one on boundaries, setting boundaries with an abusive personality, and no contact. And finally, if you are wanting to work with me, there's a few options. One, I do one-on-one coaching that's consistent, and I do meet with people consistently. That's what I spend most of my days doing. And so if you want to meet with me, you can. And what you would do is you would either go on my website to book a clarity call, or if you can't find a time that works for you, just send me an email at jessica@jessicaknightcoaching.com. You also, if you want a one-off call, which I call a validation call, you can book that directly on my website. And if the time that is listed does not work for you, just reach out. But that is a one-off, sort of like a help me understand what I'm going through type of call. And then lastly, I am working on setting up group coaching for the summer. We would meet probably once a week as a group. It will be focused on healing your trauma bond, and stay tuned for that. I should be able to give more details about that in the next episode. And now that I've gone through all of that fine print, I, as always, am thankful that you're here. And today I want to talk about something that I posted on Instagram because it became like the most shared post I've ever had, and I think for good reason. But earlier last week, I posted something that I honestly feel like I posted before, but the post said, "Narcissists rewrite history to avoid accountability. You are not crazy." I'll read it again. "Narcissists rewrite history to avoid accountability. You are not crazy." And if you don't follow me, you can at Emotional Abuse Coach on Instagram. But when this post really started getting shared a lot and commented on, and people responding to and asking me questions, I started to think about why. Why does this one hit us so hard? And I think it's really important because I think a lot of us get stuck with a narcissist or an abusive person because it is crazy making. And often I prefer to say abusive person because all narcissists are abusive, but not all abusive people are narcissists. So even if I reframe this quote, abusive people rewrite history to avoid accountability, and they do make us feel crazy. And a lot of the times, one of the first steps in realizing that you are not crazy comes after we allow our minds to go through all of it. The torture of what happened, why did it happen? But they said it like this, and I should apologize for this, and I should do that. And we get so wrapped up in what our role was and what the story was, and if the story was even real. And on top of that, how our story can be so far apart from theirs, which at times actually makes it worse because our version of the story versus their version of the story is usually not focused on. What's focused on is only theirs. And then we feel like we're not taking accountability and honoring their story. And before we know it, we've gone around in a circle and end up not even remembering what the issue was in the first place. I know for me, I didn't know what was right or wrong anymore. And so I think that quote kind of sums it up. It's that they rewrite history to avoid actually taking responsibility, accountability, and ownership for what they did. And so what do they do instead? They become the victim. They are now the victim because their version is true. And of course, they're not wrong. Why would they be wrong? Why would they have to show up differently? They feel you are wrong. And because in their eyes you are, not in reality, but in their perspective, because they want to be in control. That's their perception of reality. And so when they do this, what they are doing is challenging the way in which we see the world. It is gaslighting. They're challenging the way we perceive how things happen to us, which usually go along with what actually happened to us, our reactions, our feelings. But if they saw what we see, they would be horrified if they had a soul. So you always become the bad guy in the story because, again, they rewrite the history. And this is a real fear for a lot of us because abusive people target people that they can control. They target people that they envy. They target empathetic people. They target strong people. They target women and men that have their shit together so they can leech right off of it. They target people who care about how people feel most of the time, right? Because imagine two narcissists together, two abusive people together that abuse in the same way. That would be a toxic overhaul volcano. They would just burn each other down. Neither one would ever be in control. They wouldn't get any supply out of that. And of course, we all have toxic behaviors. And I'm the last person in the world to say that I don't have any. I do. We all do. But I'm not sitting here rewriting history and avoiding accountability. We get stuck reeling because now there's this new story. And now if we challenge their perspective, now we're doing something wrong because they get into the cycle of saying that we can't say that they're gaslighting us because now we're changing their perception. It's crazy making. And that's the intent because that's how they maintain control. It is crazy making on purpose. I think that's the part that a lot of us don't get is that it is crazy making on purpose. One of the comments on that page or on the post was that from someone saying that they started to record conversations because they kept being told they were wrong. And so now the person can't rewrite history if it's recorded. Well, they do. I've seen it done, but I've also been there too. And it is so hard. This is definitely a sign of abuse, that you're being abused when you feel like the only way you can understand if a conversation happened the way that we believed it happened is if we record it. And I am going to be upfront with you. I absolutely did this in the past because I started to feel crazy. And there was this one time, there was this 4-hour conversation I had and listened back to a few times and asked my therapist to listen back to. And I needed to listen to it to know that I was not crazy. I needed to listen to it to actually see it for what it is. But even with that, even if they knew you did it, they will take evidence and say that it's not true or that the problem is the way that you're listening to it. And it's amazing how much they can twist words that are even written in text, email. They'll say things like, you mean this? And you're like, no, I didn't. I'm like, yes, you did. Like, no, I didn't. And it kind of goes on and on and on until you have no idea. They rewrite history to avoid accountability. And often this is the place where we get really stuck because we're operating in these relationships based on how we would act in a healthy relationship. So they shift blame. They try and make themselves appear better than they are. And then they recreate this pedestal that we probably had them on, but now they're putting themselves on to protect their ego. They cannot be wrong. They know they're wrong, but they can't accept it. And so they bend and twist the truth, and then they start to believe a new false truth as if it already happened because it put them in a better light. And therefore, we are left feeling like the crazy one. And now here we are, and we continue down the cycle of arguing about things that don't actually even exist. And on top of that, talking to someone who doesn't really exist, because that person, the person that is projecting all the stuff onto us, we don't see them as they actually are. And they don't see themselves as they actually are either. They see us how they want to. And if we saw them as they actually are, we would see that they're trying to change the way that we see ourselves. Because who they are is someone who will stop at nothing to manipulate the reality in the world that they want because they don't see us or treat us as a person. One of the things I did when I was healing was ask myself, what would a secure person do? What would a healthy person do? Does a healthy person rewrite history to escape accountability? Does a healthy person tell me my perceptions are wrong? Does a healthy person change the narrative? Does a healthy person live in victim mode? And victim mode from a narcissist doesn't look like a typical victim mode. It's like a hyper aggressive, I am the victim, the world is against me, everybody hates me, can't you see? Does a healthy person act that way? A healthy person takes accountability, which is why that quote resonates with so many people. Because you are not crazy. You take accountability for the things you do and often things you don't do. And the abuser is likely telling you that you don't ever take enough accountability. But that's not who you are. You are someone that likes to see things in a fair way. And you've been hurt and you've been bruised and you've been hurt so badly that you don't even know what left and right is half the time. And that's all you want, right? Is to be able to see things clearly. How much would you give in order just to know and be able to trust your own perception? And that's why you're here. You are here because you want to understand your reality. Instead of having a healthy conversation with your partner to be able to see where you are misaligned, where you align, to figure out the repair, your partner is instead spending more time focusing on how they don't have to take accountability for what happened. They don't have to work on the relationship, which means the relationship actually doesn't progress at all. It just remains in the cycle of abuse. Their control is what progresses, not the relationship. It constantly puts them in a superior position because their version of reality is what we see as accurate, and yours is not. And over time, it gets more and more inaccurate to the point that you don't even believe your own reality. And so how many of us get to this point in the podcast and are like, why? I don't trust myself. How do I trust myself? What do I do? I can't make a freaking decision. I don't know. And of course, there's strategies that we can lean into to begin to ungaslight ourselves. There's actually an episode I have about this, and I'll tag it so you can easily find it. But sometimes I think we have to take a step back and let some of these quotes really sink in and ask ourselves, what is happening? I think there is another important part of this whole puzzle that might help you. And so I'm going to do a quick diversion because I think it's important. In the book, Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men, Lundy Bancroft says essentially that abusers take away our right to feel feelings. It's a right that's reserved only for them. And I think that's a really deep quote and a really deep idea, because if you think about it, it's true. Feelings are reserved just for them. When you have feelings, they claim you're overreacting. They claim you're being dramatic. When they're angry, that's a feeling, isn't it? But they feel like that feeling, that anger, is justified. They might not even call it a feeling. They might just say it's anger. When they're pissed, when they're pushing a perspective, that's them. Those are feelings. But how many times has an abusive person said to you, don't be mad, don't be sad. You're not really mad about that, right? Why do you feel that way? You can be done crying now. Can you just not be mad? Oh, you're upset? They take away our right to feel. So not only are they rewriting history of events, but they're also naming what and when we can feel feelings. And yet, we are the ones that wonder if we're crazy. And I haven't talked that much on this podcast, at least, about how the narcissistic or abusive person makes themselves into a victim. But I definitely think that needs to be a future episode, because It's another element of why this is all truly crazy making. And that is what it is meant to do. It is meant to throw us off, because if you think about it, it's like the manipulative person hurts you, but then if it hurts, it makes you mad. If you end up getting fed up, if you finally find your way to leave, they're like, oh, now you hate me. You're so mad at me. You're so angry. You left. So now they're the victim. I've had a lot of episodes on here about different variations of what this looks like and how it comes up. But just to be clear, there are a lot of reasons why they do it. None of them are healthy. And maybe we need to look at why. What are they avoiding? What causes them to do this? And this is not so that you can feel bad for them. This is so that you can see it's not you. It's not your fault. They do this because they don't want to deal with shame. Narcissism is rooted in shame and rooted in fear, vulnerability. And it's like really addressing the shame. They rather throw at anybody than actually deal with it. They will throw anybody under the bus. They will throw them in front of the bus. I have an episode with Ben Taylor that talks a little bit more about shame and addressing why they avoid shame that I think would be really helpful. And I'll tag that in the show notes too. And one way that they avoid the shame is by projecting it onto you. They take their feelings, put them onto you, and then blame you for feeling them or making them feel that way. They also might feel guilty. And I always wondered, when they discard us, do they ever feel guilty? They might feel guilty, but then not feeling the shame prevents them from actually feeling the guilt and avoid the accountability around feeling guilty by just projecting it back onto us because it's our fault. Sometimes I think about, does this person see us as a person? Because a person doesn't really discard another person, right? Nobody ghosts a fiance. Nobody leaves a relationship after 5, 10 years, 1 year, 7 months, and not say anything. A person who loves us wouldn't just discard us like a person if they actually saw us as a human being. But they don't. And a healthy person wouldn't want a relationship to end and let the other person just sit around with a bunch of question marks if they actually cared about them. And one way they must not actually see us as people is because they're running so far away from guilt that they'll project any blame onto us, because keeping us in that other space of not a true human being, not worthy of feelings, releases them of all guilt that they would have to feel because they've convinced themselves that we deserve it. They're also in severe, severe denial that they would and could do anything wrong, because that would challenge their very big ego. But if they're a victim, it doesn't challenge their ego, because then other people lift them up. And I think a lot of this comes back to control. And I've been talking about this more and more, that they always needing to be in control. And it's not as simple as like, oh, they just want to be in control. They're a control freak. It's like they need to be in a place of power over you. They need to be in a place of power over you all the time. They need to be in control, or even the illusion of control. So even if you have a powerful perspective, even if your perspective is right, they still need to be in control of you. And it's sickening and it's maddening. I think it kind of brings us back to the quote in the first place, that they rewrite history to escape accountability. They're not rewriting history because they know how it actually went. They're rewriting history to maintain power over us. Because if they're in control of the perspective, if they're in control of the story, if they're in control of the history, then we are always wrong. So it's still power over. And we feel crazy. And then they tell us we're crazy most of the time as well. So we feel it, and then this person that we have put all our feelings on are also telling us we are crazy. And now all of the decisions and the way that they interact with us is because they think we're crazy, because they told us that we're crazy. And so the cycle never stops. The cycle of abuse just goes on. And this is why people like me will say they won't change, because we're saying that in order for them to change first, they need to start with taking accountability for how they show up, but they don't look on how they're showing up. A healthy person who wanted to change these behaviors, well, first, a healthy person wouldn't have these behaviors, but if somebody wanted to change these behaviors, they would have to look at this and say, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't like this. They would not be okay if we rewrote history. Actually, they're not okay with our actual version of history most of the time. And we are rewriting history in their perspective because we're writing it as to what actually happened and challenging their beliefs of what they're saying did happen, or their projection of what happened, or what they're claiming did happen. And they're not even okay with that. They're not okay with us having a perspective. So where do we exist in this at all? And what can you do? What can you do if you're in a relationship where somebody continues to rewrite the history and rewrite events and retell events based on their belief system, and you are stuck in this cycle? And right now you might say, well, Jessica, I'm challenging their perception. And I'll say this. There's not two sides of a story in an abusive relationship. There's usually one based on facts, and there's one based on pure perception and gaslighting. And I've told the story before, and I'm going to do it again because I do think that it's a good example. But a few years ago, I was supposed to hang out with my boyfriend at the time, and we had a plan to do a certain thing that he wanted to do that was in his neighborhood. It did require me to clear my work schedule for that evening to be able to do it, but he had been asking, and it was something that felt like it was important to him. We live close by in theory, but during traffic, it's not very close. And just city living, 15 minutes can easily turn to 40. So I text when I leave, text when I get there, text that I can't find parking. It took longer, and I know I texted before I left too, and I'm not getting any answers at all, nothing. And I said to myself, okay, maybe he's in the shower, maybe he went out for a second, maybe he's talking to somebody, maybe he has a work call. Like I'm, going through like, oh, there's all these things it could be. And I'm getting a little anxious because it's like, oh, well, he hasn't responded. I hope everything's okay. I had a key to the apartment, so I open the door and he's asleep. So I go in and I gently wake him up. And I'm freaking out a little bit because I could tell he's not ready to go, hasn't showered. And I was a bit in panic because of all the time I took to get there with all the traffic and all the parking and all of this and all of that. We were already late. And so now we're triple late. And I'm there and I'm like, and this was towards the end of the relationship, which I think is important. I was like, I'm going to get blamed for this, aren't I? In my head. I'm totally going to be blamed for this. And so I hate waking people up. I'm sure I have some sort of trauma around that at one point I'll explore. But I wake him up and I go, and he goes, why is your face like that? And that's the first thing he says. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, why is your face like that? And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he's like, I'm like, I don't know. I was scared to wake you up, but I don't know. And I didn't expect you to be asleep. I thought we were going to go. And I'm thinking in my head, why am I in trouble? I'm like, I'm sorry. Should I not have woken you up? And he's like, no, you should have. And I'm like, okay, well, like, do you want to go take a shower? I don't know what you need. And the day before this, we actually removed a couch from his apartment. So I turned around to give him space. I went to go sit on the stairs and that were like in his home. I started answering emails on my phone, just trying to give him space. And also I'm a disaster in the morning. When I just wake up, like I need time. And so I'm like, one, I'm going to try and keep the peace. I'm going to go here and stay calm and do something productive that gets me out of the way. But you can very clearly see I'm already walking on eggshells. I was walking on eggshells as I walked into that apartment. And me today wouldn't do that. This is not my dream. This is not ideal. And I also believe that in a healthy relationship, if somebody wants to do something, then like they'd wake up and be like, oh shit, gotta go. I'll be right out. I'm so sorry. But I was afraid, and I kept wondering, why am I so afraid? And he just would not stop focusing on my facial expressions. And then it turned into, why am I sitting over there? And I start thinking through like all of the, like, why is this all on me right now? And then he looks over at me and he's like, you're being weird. And I'm like, I'm not being weird. And then he's like, you threw out the couch. I'm like, you threw out the couch yesterday. I don't know. Like, I just wanted to give you space. And he's like, well, why would you sit over there and not over here? And I was like, because I'm trying to give you space. I'm trying to keep myself busy. And then this went on while the shower was running and he never got into it. And this whole thing ended up being about my face, my negativity, and how I was showing up. And why do I always complain about parking? And if I tried so hard to make it there, there for him, why do I care? That he's tired. He had a long day. And I was like, okay, why didn't you cancel then? There was never an I'm sorry. There was never I didn't plan on falling asleep. It was never like, I'm sorry we missed it. And in this book, there's essentially a point that if this person is really going to change, that something that he's going to need to do is to be able to understand that he can no longer think that you are the problem, that they do need to take responsibility, that your version of reality is actually what the truth is. Maybe even that they have to accept your truth as the truth, and that you're going to choose to accept your truth as the truth because we trust that you're not the one who's maintaining power over and trying to control, or else you wouldn't be here. And that's an important part of the puzzle. It's a really big, important part of the puzzle, because a central theme of somebody who avoids accountability is that they need to start with the process of grappling with their responsibility for their actions. And this is on page 262 of the book, but it says, one of the central themes in the change process for a destructive partner is his inner process of grappling with his responsibility for his own actions. He will continue, and probably for a long time, have a great deal of inner dialogue in which he's arguing with himself that you caused him to behave the way that he did and you have exaggerated the problem. One way that you can get an indication that the wrong side is winning the internal debate is if he is keeping emotional distance from you and making excuses not to be close. And what they're really saying here is that, like, then that person resents you from having to be better, therefore punishing you for calling him out on their issues, therefore making you feel crazy for having feelings at all. Everything sort of goes back to this. And so really at the end of the day, this quote, I think, resonates with so many people because we're all, whether it's coworkers, family, friends, lovers, partners, fiancés, husbands, wives, we are done wanting to feel crazy. You wouldn't be here if you didn't not want to feel crazy anymore. You're not crazy. Some of the steps I do think are understanding what's going on so you can depersonalize it, but there's a lot of beginning to ungaslight yourself and get really clear on what your facts are, which doesn't mean that we lose compassion, but it does mean that we stop letting others tell us what our reality is. If you need support, you can reach out to me at jessica@jessicaknightcoaching.com. That's my email address. You can find me at Emotional Abuse Coach on Instagram and my website, emotionalabusecoach.com. If you need support, please reach out.